right, hello everybody. Today we're looking at early 20th century women in art, specifically visual art during the suffrage movement. And if we're being more specific, looking at cartoons, political cartoons, and a few drawings too, but largely cartoon based, and how that influenced the women's suffrage movement in Britain and the United States. So if we go here, there's the topics. I'll let you guys look through those if you want the outline. Provide a little background and overview of women's involvement in the suffrage movement, because it started from, if we're looking at in the United States, from before the beginning of the United States, but also, I guess, since. But it's from the very beginning, women have been pushing for the right to vote. And there were a variety of ways that they did this. The most common way initially were actually within the written word. So letters, newspapers, petitions, and then the spoken word, committees, protests, things like that. Right? We don't have a lot of the visual language until a little bit later in time. And so, but women were always pushing for, in different ways, for the right to vote. One of the best ways of seeing that in the very beginning was Abigail Adams, who wrote to her husband, John Adams, which one of her letters is, we basically have given it the title, Remember the Ladies. She did not title her own letter. We gave that title later. And it's in part because that word, the Remember the Ladies, is in that letter. So she writes her husband, John Adams, and says, hey, I heard that you guys are putting together a new code of laws, and I ask that you remember the ladies when you do so. And then she proceeds to explain why she thinks it's important that women are subject to the tyranny of men if they don't have some protections and they need a voice. And she also semi-threatens that they were so determined that they would foment their own rebellion if ignored. Well, he wrote back to her, and it was not super nice. And they were prolific writers. Like, I have a book of all their letters, so they wrote a lot. But he wrote back to her and basically laughed at her and said, "Well, that's super funny." And then, but no, right? That's not going to happen. And he basically says that we all know that you are ruler, or that we're ruler in name only, and that if we gave up that last vestige of power, then men would be subject to the despotism of the petticoat. Despotism is like cruel rule. And then worse, that's bad enough as it is. But then worse, what he does is he basically says, I would hope that all men would fight against women getting the right to vote as strongly as they would fight against being a despot, a king, a tyrant, an oligarchy. So he basically is just listing off all the types of rule that they saw as bad, and saying that he hoped men would fight just as strongly against that as they would against women's right to vote. She was very mad. She ends up writing a letter to her friend saying, this is what he said. Can you believe what he said? And I'm so pissed. And basically, let's foment a rebellion. Now, that didn't happen, but it does show that from even before the United States is fully developed and created, that there were women trying to get the right to vote. And then women got together in larger numbers again later in U.S. history around the Civil War, with the abolition movement and the Civil War itself, pushing not only for abolition but women's rights, as they saw the connection between the two. And one of the big events that took place there was the Seneca Falls Convention with the Declaration of Sentiments. And this was meant to mirror the Declaration of Independence. So they intentionally used language, and actually just word for word in some cases. So they used language of the prelude, where it said all men are created equal in the Declaration of Independence. They changed the wording to all men and women are created equal. But they actually left in the rest, almost all the rest of the preamble, which basically said that if you have inalienable rights, and if the government at any point becomes detrimental or destructive of these inalienable rights, then it's the duty of the people to rebel and put in a new government that will actually protect those rights. They left all that in because they wanted the echoes of the Declaration of Independence so that people would hopefully have a connection to it. And then instead of listing the grievances of the king, they listed the grievances of all the ways men have denied them rights and opportunities. There was a large group that came to this convention. However, they did not have everyone sign the document at the end because several people, there was one grievance that was too controversial for some people, which was the right to vote. Like, most were okay with all of the other in the list, but the right to vote was seen as too much, in part because you still had the public sphere and the private sphere, right? And the public sphere was where politics lied and voting, and this was for men, right? The private sphere was for women. And so many felt that that was pushing too far into the public sphere by getting involved in politics. Yeah, sure, let's protect women from being abused and letting them have jobs and college education and being able to get divorced, but the voting is political, and political is too far. It was a sentiment at the time. I mean, there were plenty of women who were already involved politically with the abolition movement and pushing through all of that, but that was still contentious at that point. Then at the end of the war, they hoped to they had hoped that the amendments, which freed the slaves and then gave them rights, including voting, would include women. It did not. So before they kind of, I don't want to say gave up, but certainly stopped pressing for this, they tried the new departure, which was basically an interpretation. Oops. Let me write that in there here. Interpretation of the 15th Amendment. And it's been, essentially, because they had hoped with the 14th and 15th Amendment that, again, it would be in there somewhere. So what they did is they tried to use semantics in the language that had said that the people are citizens, and the citizens then have the right to vote as citizens. And so the way that they broke it down, they said, well, women are people. So if women are people, then people are citizens. And if citizens have the right to vote, therefore women have the right to vote. What's crazy about this is what they did after they came up with this kind of semantics interpretation. They decided to go to the polls. And this is, back then you would register to vote at the polls too. And so they wanted to try out the new departure idea by convincing poll workers to not only let them register to vote, but to vote. Susan B. Anthony, it was the only one that was able to convince the poll worker to both register and vote. Other women were able to convince the poll workers to let them register, but they wouldn't let them vote. So this was seen as a huge kind of victory initially, but then she was arrested not that long after this event and charged with a Civil War charge. Basically, it was the charge was for Civil War, specifically Confederate officers, and that there were rules with Reconstruction that Confederate officers couldn't vote. And they charged her with that, which she was neither a Confederate soldier nor an officer, but it was just to legally try to shut down what they were doing. So this again does not end women's pushing for the right to vote. It just it does slow down a little bit before it kind of comes back into full swing in the late 1800s. and then full steam ahead in the early 1900s and stuff like that. And what happens over time is, and Britain is actually going to be the one that has a higher push for women's rights, and actually women get the right to vote before the United States. But so the U.S. was influenced by what women in Britain were doing. Both those started to expand beyond just these two, the written and spoken word, and started using cartoons, posters, paintings, postcards, and sculptures. And we're going to look mostly at cartoons and posters and postcards, but all again under the idea of cartoons. So we're going to look at cartoons on posters, or at least connected to cartoons, and postcards and things like that. Satirical drawings, political cartoons are part of that too. And they realized the power of the visual arts, and the way that it could be used in propaganda could be applied to the suffrage movement. The anti-suffrage movement will also recognize this and use it as well. And for sure, these images were a huge part of helping shape public perception that pushed women being able to get the right to vote. It also empowered women, as they were able to, other women artists were able to portray women in this strong and powerful way. Now, before it gets to full-fledged what we're looking at with cartoons, there are some early examples of this movie using the visual imagery and art to make a point. Gaudy's magazine and Ladies' Book was a super popular magazine in the 19th century. And it was it published a ton of things: poems, songs, fashion, illustrations, advice, tips for being a housewife. Essentially, it largely portrayed women as domestic and gentle. And in fact, this whole book you could use as an example for the cult of domesticity, which we talked about before. All those ideals of the cult of domesticity were reinforced in this magazine. And there were benefits, because a lot of the authors were women, and that was connected to the cult of domesticity, because one of the things that expanded from their like the economic manager option is that women started becoming more and more authors, because you could still be at home while you wrote a novel or you wrote for a magazine, and then you earn money that could help you be a good economic manager in the household. So each of the list from when I put them up before for the cult of domesticity, each one of those eventually allowed women to expand into other things, and this was one of them. And it's the best example of kind of the embodiment of cult of domesticity. And there was pushback when women did try to speak publicly for women's rights. Not everyone agreed with the cult of domesticity and the Ladies' Book magazine on that women should be portrayed that way. Mary Wollstonecraft was a well-known writer, and she wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Women. And this really was this argument that women were as smart as men, and they just needed the opportunities. So the argument was, they're saying, women are too different to have the same intellect as men or be educated as men. And she argued, no, it's just that women haven't been given that opportunity. And if they're given that opportunity, they are just as equally intellectual as men themselves. The other issue that popped up early on was with Frances Wright. She was an very early suffragist who also lectured on the abolition movement and was very passionate about that as well. The thing was, again, that there still was that public-private sphere, and she lectured to groups of both men and women together, which many saw as not proper for women to be doing so. Women could speak to other groups of women, but for a woman to speak to a group of men and women together, the scandal. But this cartoon is right here is a good example of the pushback that many early women abolitionists and women's rights movement faced when they tried to speak out, when they tried to push for rights. So this is it shows a woman with a duck's face. This is supposed to be uh, oops, Frances Wright. Um, and it says, and it shows her talking and reading from a book, and it says, a downright gabbler. And they crossed out the W with her last name, right, to let you know that's who they were mentioning, or a goose that deserves to be hissed. So there were early political cartoons and cartoons that were used to dismiss women who were pushing for the right to vote and for women's rights and the abolition movement. And she was so mocked and attacked for what many saw as encroaching on the male sphere and role, that it really did ruin her reputation. And ultimately, as she became the center of ridicule, she at one point fled public life because of how her reputation was in ruins. And many early women faced this type of level of criticism and scrutiny in attempts to ruin their public perception, their reputation. And certainly Fanny White's, or Frances White's, but they called her Fanny. There was even a saying like, don't be a Fanny. And that was like a warning of um, what could happen to you, right? And so there were a lot of things with speaking publicly about women being, proper, appropriate, high moral character, so that others didn't end up, um, you know, experiencing the same criticism and destruction that Frances Wright did. So nonetheless, even with these threats, though, there were plenty of women who stepped up and pushed for the abolition movement. And again, in pushing for the abolition movement and then to slavery, they saw connections to slavery and the lack of control in our lives as similar to what women went through, especially specifically married women, which is not surprising that it connected to the women's rights movement. This led to songs being very popular at this time. Music was seen as a popular form to support the suffrage movement. There was a song called Woman's Right in 1853 that was sung and spread through the conventions at the time. You also had a Seneca Falls song that was created after. It was after Seneca Falls, but it was created in connection to the Seneca Falls. And the part of the lines from this say, "Daughters of freedom, the ballot be yours." Though that's the title, but then it also says it again, "Daughters of freedom, the ballot be yours. Wield it with wisdom, your hope is secure. Rights are the equal, this you claim, bright by your guerdon, fair your flame." So it was meant to be a rallying cry for women in support of the suffrage movement. Over time, though, what was added to the written and spoken word was visual imagery as a way to promote women's rights movement. It also was a way to protest it. There was a lot of anti-suffrage movement political cartoons and postcards and things around the same time that women's organizations were starting to use them as well. You have one of the earlier cartoons that shows up in 1859 shows a woman giving a speech to a group of men who seem to be kind of jeering and protesting and looking at her with unhappiness. And the cartoon's title, the cartoon's title or sentence, I guess you could say, was, "Ye may session of ye women's rights convention, ye order of ye day, denouncing you, ye lords of creation." And it was meant to be this harsh criticism of the women's rights and speaker of the day denouncing the men. The women in the illustration were also portrayed with sneering and haughty expressions. Sometimes women's femininity was also over exaggerated. meant to kind of bring it to the absurd, right? Part of that type of cartoon is to try to bring something to the absurd to make a point with it. And the common themes with this, besides just displeasure, was showing what the Age of Iron does, this role reversal. In the cartoon here, The Age of Iron, you can see the woman who is overly fancy dressed, and I mean, they're exaggerating it with the back there and the hairdo and hat, is getting into a carriage with a woman who's driving and a woman on the back that's like the porter, while the men are doing what is traditionally seen as like the women's work or the domestic work. And it's basically saying man as he expected to be, as he expects to be, man as he expects to be. It's hard to read there. As he expects to be, right? And these anti-suffrage images were prevalent and used. It was meant to kind of show the neglected husband at home doing the domestic chores while she goes out. And these are meant to be these critiques on the early women's rights movement in the later 1800s, and certainly shows the resistance to that movement in the process. With that said, just as much as there was anti-suffrage cartoons and illustrations, pro-suffrage imagery also contributed to the whole discussion and art of using art to make points for that. And you have here is an example, and this one says women at the polls in New Jersey in the good old times, right? And in this illustration, and you have women that are looking respectable, walking up and going to the poll and providing their vote. Even in the title, talking about the good old times, because there was a period in time where New Jersey allowed women the right to vote before it was revoked. And so it's showing women voting at the polls in it is a positive imagery, right, of women. And there were plenty of these type of illustrations and drawings that were like that were meant to combat the kind of anti-suffrage movement in its process. And certainly these very early movements kind of foreshadow the art that would be produced in mass as the suffrage movement picked up speed, because it becomes more and more common as it, in part because, the whole, a picture's worth 1,000 words, whether that's an actual photo or a drawing. It has influence, and people attached to it, they remember it, and it certainly is a powerful way of pushing your message and gaining support for that message. So if we look at the influence in the British suffrage movement, when Britain started to use visual images to push the suffrage movement in an organized manner, they ended up doing so before the United States. As I mentioned, again, the United States is actually going to draw a lot from what the British were doing in the early years. And one of the main focus was with the Artist Suffrage League, right? The Artist Suffrage League, which you have a specific suffrage league for artists, and their job, what they wanted to do was have this organization of professional women artists that supported the suffrage movement, and could help use that to persuade and sway people to support the movement as well. And it was allowed. They used a lot of different types of drawings and cartoons, and in many cases to somewhat portray the same thing. And this one here, we have convicts, lunatics, and women have no vote in Parliament. And the British really liked using this comparison. There's a lot of cartoons out there that use the same imagery. right? Of course, the woman is, college educated, and the whole idea of looking proper, and she's chained up, right, with what would be seen as two individuals that were not proper in society. And the argument being, why are women with this group? Why are women put in with this group, right? It basically says there doesn't make sense why we should be connected with these people, and instead that we should have rights. It was also meant to, of course, just to point out, um, the absurdity of not allowing women to vote, and because this type of thing did resonate with people. It gave people a visual idea of, oh, women in chains or women locked up, or the comparison here, what a woman may be and yet not have the vote, and then what man may have been and yet not lose the vote. So this one goes a little bit further, still using that similar comparison I just talked about, but they're going to look at all the different things women can be that are seen as dignified professions, and then they're going to look at the non-dignified roles of men to contrast why do these men have the right to vote, but women who do all of these proper high caliber things cannot vote themselves. So let's take a look at that. You have right for what women could be. Then you have a mayor, a nurse, a mother, a doctor, a teacher, a factory hand, right? What men, a convict, a lunatic, a proprietor of white slaves. Of course, notice how it's specifying white slaves, not slaves in general. And that is certainly something that is obvious here with the cartoons, is that the women that were portrayed in these cartoons were white women, and largely middle class and above white women. Lower classes, black women, and any other women that didn't fit into that kind of narrow category were largely not represented in these cartoons and artwork that the suffragist movement used. And in fact, it's one of the things that becomes problematic in the United States, is that there's a huge push for women's rights. It finally goes through, and then most of the women kind of just said, oh, all of the black women that were fighting for women's rights with us, yeah, good luck with you. And kind of they left them. Some outright basically said, well, it's not our problem. And while there were some women who continued to try to push for it, black women ultimately ended up forming their own groups and taking it into their own hands to continue pushing. But the reality is that in the South, this is during the period of segregation. Women are not allowed to vote, even though technically the 19th Amendment, they should have had the right to vote anywhere. Definitely in the South, they were still, just like with men, denied the right to vote through some crazy series of rules and legal twisting to make it happen. So I think that's important to point out, that this is largely targeting middle class and above white women. And the artwork did very much kind of ignore everyone else. And then unfit for service or drunkard, right? So the idea is that these were all negative things, and yet men could still vote, right? If they're saying, how can men be all these things but they can vote, and these are all positive, but women can't vote. And it did this I think they used this comparison a lot because it did resonate with people, right? They were trying to show the absurdity of women not having the right to vote. And so by making these comparisons and contrast, it worked to highlight that difference. And certainly asking, should women be classed with these people? Does that make sense, right, in the process of things? And then you had other images that use the personification of justice as a woman. This was a very common one. This one here, we'll come back to we'll come back to the other one in just a second here. But this here, this idea, this woman trumpet that is a fighter or a soldier, or again represents justice, was super common type of theme. That was also like, that was definitely more the dignified, powerful theme. The other ones were trying to show women, in these important, dignified roles and being rejected. But they also had plenty of cartoons and posters and images that just were meant to show women as powerful, as strong, as dignified, and connected to justice. You also have this other one that was at Justice at the Door. So there was a cartoonist, Mary Landis, and it was, her title of this one was Justice at the Door. And what it showed was, it was meant to show, again, this idea of equating women suffragists with justice, but are denied equal rights. So blind justice stands at the door of the House of Commons in this artwork with the words "Justice at the door. I surely am not excluded," right? Written under justice's feet. So the idea of that, if women didn't have the right to vote, they were denying justice, the right to entry into the House of Commons. And again, this imagery was super powerful, and the SL understood this as they continued to push for change. And so they continued to employ professional and amateur artists, which was a big thing in actually helping push women into having a way to get paid for their artwork, and expanded these women's visibility as well. And they also did a lot with postcards, because those would not only get purchased for souvenirs, but then family and friends would send them to other people. They were also really easy to hand out in like marches and rallies. Like a big poster, you're not going to carry around with you. A little postcard, super easy to hand out, and have people have and spread that around, because they knew that it would be beneficial. The other thing, of course, that they did to encourage this, besides like paying women and professionals, is they had contests for the best posters. And then what's important with this is, not only did then those best, whoever won the contest, their poster was often featured in different magazines, but they promoted the artist. So again, the whole idea of boosting and pushing forward women artists during this time, while at the same time pushing for women's rights, and specifically the right to vote, through this new medium, or at least it's been around, but a newly popularized medium that got people to pay attention. Because before, with just the protests and the petitions, women were more easily set aside. When they started seeing all of these cartoons, it did start to have people questioning, why are we denying women the right to vote? One notable poster here is the "Coming in with the Tide," which of course was meant to depict the inevitability of women's suffrage. So this was another type of thing that the British liked to showcase, was basically to try to convince people, like, why are you fighting against this? We will eventually be successful. And so you're fighting in something that's a losing battle. And so in this image, it's meant to she's supposed to be the anti-suffragist, right? The anti-suffragist. And then you have women here on the boat, and it says women's suffrage. And they're looking, one woman's got her arm flung out in what looks like excitement as they're coming in on the tide. And the tide, of course, has the words vote, votes, votes, right, everywhere. And the anti-suffrage woman looks more haggard and tired, while she's futilely sweeping away the water that's coming up onto her porch. And this was also meant to try to convince people, right, that you're fighting a losing battle. You're going to keep pushing against this, but we're going to succeed. These images started to use more and more as it got closer to looking like women in Britain would get the right to vote. And the US will be actually the same thing. When it became clear that they were being successful and they were having sway, you start to see a lot more of these types of images to try to convince the holdouts and those that were still pushing against there wasn't a benefit essentially to do so. And then here's one more of those common themed ones I mentioned that they have a lot of. This one is it's a little blurry, but it says linked together by the law. This one adds a child to the mix. So the idea is well, there's twofold to this. One, it showcases motherhood or the domestic, right? This woman, which you presume is her child, but maybe isn't. But two, of course, children couldn't vote. They were dependents. And this was also a huge push, is that women were not dependents, right? Because this is it's very patronizing. To sit there and say, well, women can't take care of themselves, just like children can't take care of themselves. So this worked in twofold of having the young girl in chains as well, both to somewhat point out the fact just that even full-grown women can't vote, but why are they in the same boat as children? But also the absurdity of this patronizing aspect of women being dependents themselves. And then, of course, they liked their criminals and lunatics, as they called them, which, of course, has covered a bunch of different people and what that meant, and certainly had no recognition for those that had, where there weren't really any kind of mental health diagnoses at this time anyway. But it certainly could apply to people who were like criminally insane. Those who were dangerous, and then others who just had mental health issues would also get lumped in with that word. But it was meant to showcase this idea of like, if these people can vote, why can't we? And in this one, it's meant to more say, you've tied us to these people, right? So not like, because this one, they don't separate out the two groups saying, well, these men can vote. It's more like this, the other one that we saw here, where women are being chained or locked in a cage with that group. That's the kind of imagery that they're using here as well. So with this, the contests were widely circulated. Winners' names were widely printed. It promoted women artists in the process and caught the view of the American Women's Suffrage Association. I have that one here. No, so we can put it here. Oh, right here, I have it there. Okay, so the NAWSA was connected to the American Women's Suffrage Association. Let me put it, Women's Suffrage Association. So the women in the United States ended up seeing how successful this whole campaign was, and they actually purchased several posters to feature in the Women's Journal, because they saw, again, the power of what that could do. Women in the United States will eventually transition these groups to making their own cartoons, but in the earliest years, in the United States, they were actually buying these different posters in order to promote the same goals as women in Britain, and because they got to see that it was successful. You had lots of magazines as well that were promoting, again, women's rights, or pointing out what was left what they were not allowed to be a part of. The Broadside by Women's, a political union, repeatedly put in various political cartoons and captions to highlight these issues. So here on this one, you see Again, this one's separating. It says, stand back, ladies, right? And the officer is holding back the women that are supposed to be seen as well respected, while allowing all these men in jail uniforms to vote. So that the law and the officer and the law is intentionally holding women back while freely allowing criminals, because they're men, to be able to vote. So as the United States suffrage movement began to increase in the first part of the 20th century in size and support, the American artists built up their visual arts on a massive scale, and that transitioned to an organized propaganda campaign in the process. And because art was changing the way that people viewed the suffrage movement. It had significantly influenced in Britain. The women had, organizations in the United States had seen that, purchased these from them, and then started creating their own propaganda organization to produce artwork as well for their own push for that. One of the common ones that was used is this imagery that we saw here, the bugler, the woman. This type of imagery was put into multiple different posters and campaigns. This one is for the one march and mass meeting with a specific time, right? It's a call to action. So it was well liked because it was seen as this call to action. There was another one that used it in the broadside. So I went too far here with this. The broadside used this image here. But they called it the Trumpeter Awakening New York. And it shows the female bugler bearing a flag with 5 stars that represents the 5 states where women were able to vote, calling women to be prepared to fight for the vote in New York. Then it was also used in another one to just a general call. So they really liked the Trumpeter in part because it I think showcased this strong woman that was powerful, that was ready to fight, that was in charge, and was ready to push back against being denied the right to vote. Some of the other ones that were used here in this one were the Votes for Women and Women's Sphere. These were more like political cartoons and critiques, and these often were meant to be sharp and to make their point clearly, right? The idea with these is, you could almost say it's political critique, right? There's meant to be a sharp edge to the point that they're making, not just have some imagery of strong women, but making a more strong critique of the situation. So if we look in this one here, it says Votes for Women, and it has Roosevelt saying, "Let the people rule." And then you have a bunch of men down here with the sign, "We're the people." Then you have animals that are saying, "We're the animals." And then you have women that have the sign that says, "We're what?" Right? Asking where do they stand? What is their role in society? It was meant to highlight the ambiguous role and status of women in American society in the 20th century, early 20th century, and how this wasn't fully defined, and that part of the reason for that was because they were denied these rights that they should have. In this other one here, my cursor got in there at some point when I was putting it in. The women's sphere is the fence, right? And so this woman is looking up over the fence outside of the domestic sphere, right? That women were often put into. And then inside the domestic sphere, you have a toy that says gossip and a doll that says fashion. And then it says, women devotes her time to gossip and clothes because she has nothing else to talk about. Give her broader interest and she will cease to be vain and frivolous. Again, this was this kind of meant to be kind of it's a critique on the domestic sphere and the limitations on women's rights and roles, and saying like, look, when you cage up or block out and put women only in women's sphere, then they develop these negative traits of focusing on gossip and fashion and frivolous things. But if you just let women outside of that sphere, they will have more robust interest for you. I mean, and this one certainly you could argue the problems with this cartoon, but it was meant to target people who were critiquing that, oh, all women do is worry about gossip and fashion. Why would we trust them with the vote? And this was meant to specifically target that and say, because like it's you're confining them into this small space and opportunity. If you just let women outside of that, they will surprise you with what their interest and focused actions will be. The anti-suffragist movement ended up creating a series of popular anti-suffrage postcards in around 1909. There were 12 postcards total in that series. And they all, so as much as we saw, like, again, what we were just looking at for suggesting that women have rights and pushing for the suffrage movement to use this, you also had the anti-suffrage movement pushing back. And most of these postcards were showing gender role reversal. Specifically, it was meant to critique how the suffrage movement would damage the family dynamics in the way that it's supposed to be. So right in this one here, it says, I want to vote, but my wife won't let me, right? That's the role reversal. The other part, of course, is the husband is doing the laundry and watching the baby. And it says, everybody works but mother. She's a suffragist. She's a suffragette. So this idea that women, that there was meant to be humor attached to it, but also be critical of it. And this one, of course, the idea that the man did not have the rights, and that, of course, if a woman is pushing for the right to vote, then she's lazy, I guess, is what they're trying to promote here. Is everyone works but mother because she's a suffragette. These are all very critical of women. They're all very critical of this idea and they want to very specifically play up the gender role, because part of this role reversal was to create a sense of fear, right? If you create a sense of fear, then people are going to, oh God, I don't want that to happen, right? And so they pull back from that. Here are the here are three other ones. So here you have Election Day, and again, that over dressed up. And I think the whole point of this was that it was meant to show, like, oh, look how frivolous or silly, right? The suffrage movement is. The women are getting all dolled up and decked out in an excessive way to go vote, and that's just absurd and ridiculous. And then if you look at on the back again, it says, what is a suffragette without a suffering household? So, and then of course the husband is sitting in the chair feeding, having a bottle and for feeding the baby and watching the kids, while the mother, gets all super dressed up and takes off, essentially suggesting she's not, following her roles and responsibility. But just that statement, right? What is a suffragette family without a suffering household? Is meant to be harsh. It's meant to, but it's meant to be harsh. But these were also seen as humorous at the time, right? They wanted them to be seen as both something that someone could chuckle at, but also harsh enough to critique the whole situation. Here you have Uncle Sam Suffragee, which it was meant to mock essentially Uncle Sam dressing up as a woman. And then Suffragette Madonna. So this one's interesting because this one, of course, let's go back to that, uses this religious imagery. But, so here's the halo, which you would have on religious images. And then it'd be like, usually this one here, especially being Madonna, It's supposed to be Mary and baby Jesus is usually what would have been seen, right? So they're almost making him out to be this idea of a saint who is forced into that position of raising the baby and taking care of the household because, again, the mother is off, being a part of the suffrage movement and stuff. These were very, very popular. They were widely distributed through the mail and passed around. Both men and women sent these to friends and family. They did what they were expected to do, which was catch people's attention. And postcards specifically became popular with the suffrage movement because for the same reason they were popular for the anti-suffrage movement. There were lots of ways to distribute and have these around. Now, the suffrage movement did incorporate postcards into their movement because it was an easy way to spread information. The earliest ones, though, were not with pictures. The earliest postcards were just text. Right, it was still meant to be sent to the mail, but it was for text to just have information. They didn't include graphic art. They then used also a photo card. I think here we go. We have that one there. Photo cards, which featured event-specific photos. So this is kind of the order, right? They did text, they did photo cards, and then they did regular message postcards with visual images and stuff like that. This one was like the photo card because it used pictures, and pictures were a newer technology. They had been around for a little bit, but the cheapness and ability to now put them into postcards and mass produce was definitely a new technology. So people especially got a kick out of the photo cards because you could take pictures of events or rallies or things and then you send it and share it. Like, people felt like they were there, that they got to witness a part of that march or a part of that meeting, way more than the cartoons. Now, the cartoons were really good at putting forth messages and convincing people of things. The photo cards were more about connecting people to the suffrage movement and events that were taking place. They advertised the postcards, and then again, they started doing a ton of postcards as time went on. And they advertised them in magazines, they sold them in person, through the mail, they handed them out in rallies. This was another great thing. Postcards were cheap and easy to hand out at rallies. And then what you would hope is that then they would send that postcard to someone, further spreading the message with the postcards. And the AWSA was the leading producer of postcards for the suffrage movement in the United States. One common theme that they did with these postcards a lot was they used young children to make points. So we can see here this one, votes for women, and it's a young girl talking to a boy, and it says, for the work of a day, for the taxes we pay, for the laws we obey, we want something to say, right? They're basically saying if we have to do all of these things, these things already, taxes, work, we should get the right to vote. That's one of my favorite ones because it was such a clever kind of poem in that process, right? And they used trained artists. They brought in more trained artists to pay women mostly, although there were some men too, but a lot of women and stuff to produce the postcards, the posters, and pamphlets so that they could have a larger push and campaign for the suffrage movement. Here is another one using kids, or babies in this case, and it says, give mother the vote, we need it. So this idea of that women having the right to vote is important for kids and the family, which again goes to the domestic sphere. One of the things that they learned is that throughout the US history, anytime women gained rights or new jobs or roles that they could have, it happened in mass acceptance when it was connected to the domestic sphere, right? And so women began to realize that while all these other posters and postcards were beneficial in pushing the messages forth, one of the most effective, especially for men, we should specify that, right? For men, the domestic sphere argument was the most persuasive. They got more people on board by connecting it to that domestic sphere. Because then you're saying, well, yes, okay, voting is political and that's the public sphere and that's men's role. But hear me out. Our vote is important for the family. One of the things with the cult of domesticity, right, that they were supposed to do was that the home was a haven, right? It was a protective bubble that protected from the rest of the world. And so what they started saying is we can't do our job in the cult of domesticity in creating a home as a haven if we don't have some ability to vote on women's issues. And so what they tried to do is essentially connect this idea that the vote was for women. Let's put for women was about domestic or women's issues, right? So hey, we're not gonna dabble and vote in these other areas that don't have anything to do with us. We're gonna focus centrally on women's issues. And so they started doing a lot of these postcards and posters with children in a variety of ways. They didn't stop the other ways, right? They just added this component to near as it got closer, actually, to women getting the right to vote. Probably in part because they started connected to the domestic sphere, because we see a huge shift in support when people could justify it as being connected to something that was an appropriate role for women in their minds. So those who started doing that, it was clever to say, how can we do this in a way that gets people to accept it? I know, we'll make it part of the domestic sphere, right? So let's add children into it. Let's add that we have to be able to vote on women's issues to protect the home, right? Don't worry, we're not going to take over your other politics. We're going to focus on this. Of course they don't. As soon as women have the right to vote, they weren't some monolithic group. They were all individual people who had different beliefs and voted differently. But they certainly persuaded people that they were only going to vote for these kind of women's issues that were part of the domestic realm. So don't worry. And it was successful and kind of those final pushes into getting the vote and getting the 19th Amendment to pass through. So with this, it says, our food, our health, our play, our home, our schools, our work are ruled by men's votes. Isn't it a funny thing that father cannot see why mother ought to have a vote on how these things ought to be? Think it over. Again, this is very much that cult of domesticity and the role as a mother, right? Motherhood, the general domestic sphere, right? All of that is what they're trying to say. Like, what, right? These are all the food, health, play, schools, homes. That's what the moms do, right? Why are the dads the only one that have the vote? So this was very much used to reinforce that, because they realized that it had a huge influence on the success and support for women. You end up having, one of the other things that was super beneficial is that many newspapers and magazines started having women cartoonists be regular contributors to the magazines and newspapers. This not only allowed them to develop that distinct style and messaging, but again was important because it allowed for recognition and I'll say acceptance. Right? These larger newspapers and magazines were bringing women back over and over again as cartoonists, gave them more visibility and opportunity that women didn't always have in that realm. It was definitely a harder one to break into with reoccurrence. Every now and then newspapers would pick a single cartoon or something that they really liked from women. But now, because of this push and that women's cartoons being promoted through the women's magazines, the suffragist magazines, newspapers started bringing in more and more women cartoonists as regulars that were featured each week in their structure. You have Lou Rogers, who is one of the most notable early women cartoonists. You can see this one's by her as well. She was super involved in the National Women's Suffrage Association and contributed to women's journals and lots of other publications as well. And her images were appealing because they almost always contained a sense of empowerment for women. Empowering imagery, right? A lot of her stuff was to depict women taking action to correct wrongs against them. So here, women of Ohio, she's super strong, she's determined, she's breaking the chains for the different types of government, the home, all of these type of things that are not breaking, welding it together. The other one she's breaking. This one she's welding. So sorry. There was one other one I was looking at where she's breaking the chains that are causing this one. And this one she's welding together the chains and putting them together to include votes for women. So then you have home, interests, government, different things that is called the missing link, right? That together they'll put in. Other ones that she also had, I think she has 2 or 3 other ones where she's breaking the chains of that resistance against women. So, but this one was her cartoons were very popular because in part they showcased, again, women being empowered, women taking action to correct the wrong, women being in charge of their own destiny. So besides the breaking chains and welding chains together, she also had disciplining bad politicians. She had one that was vacuuming old-fashioned ideas and other activities. So this satirical images were super popular. One of the other ones, and I'm going to skip this one, I'll come back to this one in just a minute. You have was the Dispossessed. And in this cartoon, a hen appears at a government demonstration on how to run a nest without waste. But to her surprise, she finds a rooster, which is the U.S. government, right, being in charge of a nest, which the rooster didn't do, right? So it's meant to, this was a critique of the government telling women what to do, which was still argued to this day of the government being involved in women's bodies. You know, the idea that not just the government involved in women's bodies and choices, but men specifically involved in these choices. This hasn't, this cartoon to me is something that's like, hey, this is still going on today. This hasn't changed at all. But of course, this made to be the shock of the hen being surprised that she thought she was going to go, learn about how to run an efficient nest, and yet why is the rooster the one running it? And then you have this one, meanwhile they drown. And it says, when all women want it, I will throw it to them. And the life preserver says, votes for women. Right? And of course, it's a man holding on to it. And he's saying, oh, I'll throw this life preserver, votes for women, when all women want it. And then you have this very dressed up, well-to-do woman saying, we don't need it. Right? And then you have all these women. There's a baby. And it says sweatshops, white slavery, disease, filth, right? And the guy not throwing the preserver because their justification is, well, not all women want it. And so instead, meanwhile, they drown. So these were meant to be more harsh and thought-provoking than some of the other ones that were kind of cheeky and just meant to of course push the agenda and fun, but not quite to bring down the hammer, if you will, on their critique and structure of that. And these were also very popular as well, and certainly played a slightly different role in that kind of harsh satire and political cartoon than like the children one, which was still useful and important. I actually, in fact, I would argue that the ones that referred to the domestic sphere were super important. But this is a little bit more. Yeah, think about it, but it's not the harsh critique that the hen one was, if you will. The other type of posters that actually showed up around this time are ones that actually kind of like the anti-suffrage, the husband Madonna. You have the halo effect and religious connection with women, right? So in this case, let Ohio women vote. The sun is creating the halo around her head. She has wheat on either side of her, um, and then the mountains that are framing her. And it was, if you look at like any kind of religious artwork, that has the component of like the halo, the Byzantine artwork, along with some other ones later than that. This was a very common theme. So again, the idea of a saint, it comes to mind in that process. Same kind of thing here. The halo with little mountains on the side with her. Look how long and wide the dress is. That was meant to create this kind of flow and encompassing like arm span that, again, this idea of that religious icons had with the kind of robes. And then she's holding a banner that says votes for women. So this was also a popular style of posters that were drawn and painted during this time as well. So with all this, whether it's the harsh satirical cartoons, whether it's the more lighthearted cartoons, where if it's or a combination of in between, or the posters and paintings that showcase the religious components to it, it was super successful in the sense of getting the message out and having people support the women's movement. As it became clear that the suffrage movement would be successful, there was another shift in the theme of artwork, which was that it was the shift was to critique those who supported suffrage only when it was likely to pass. They had a ton that were about like getting on the bandwagon, like, oh, you're only getting on the bandwagon now, right? And it was a sense of feeling like frustration that these people, only now that it looked like that was the way the wind was blowing, that they were willing to support it. And I'm sure, and definitely with those ones, some of the critique was, you aren't serious. You're just going with the flow of what's happening. And we also, there was some of, we don't want you to take credit for this happening, right? We did all the hard work. You don't get to jump on at the last second and then claim you did something. So there was that addressing that push and people coming in last minute. There was also a continued push to target anti-suffragists. Again, with this idea that we're so close to getting the right to vote, let's try to attack, not just those that are coming in at the end that aren't really serious and never did help in any way at all, but let's also push harder against the anti-suffragists so that they don't get any steam at the very end and somehow sabotage the vote. You also continue to have the mother protector imagery in the Women's Citizen magazine, right? The cover here is this, mother holding and gazing into her infant's eyes saying, women bring all the voters into the world. Let women vote. So again, they went really hard on, for like I showed with the other examples of this domestic sphere and how it was important within that domestic sphere to let women vote. So that also continued to play that kind of important role in that. Ultimately, the 19th Amendment passed. Well, it passed on June 4th, 1919, and then was ratified August 18th in 1920. And this allowed women to vote it was a federal law, so all states now women could vote. Again, with the caveat that, of course, right, what this meant was this was largely excluded Black women. Again, technically, Black women could vote, and in some places in the North, they were able to, but the South, we'll put it here, the segregated South was very much meant to exclude Black women from being able to vote because they were already excluding Black men from being able to vote. This did lead to issues, as I mentioned, because while the suffrage movement maybe have seen as done for white women, it was only really getting started for Black women who now found, who for many felt that they were abandoned by the women that they had worked with to push for the right to vote. Now, again, there were some that continued to push with women, Black women, to make sure they also got the right to vote. But just as there were some that did that, there were plenty of well-known suffragists who pretty much was like, okay, well, we'll think about it, but we're good right now. Let us celebrate this. And someone was dismissive of the fact they're like, but we aren't voting yet. The South still has all these rules. They had a ton of rules that they used, including a literacy exam, poll tax, that was all meant to make it super difficult to be able to vote. They couldn't just come out and say, no, Black men and women can't vote, because that was against the law. And especially now with women being able to vote. But what they could do is make it really hard, if not impossible, for them to pass the tests they needed to take to vote, and or charge a poll tax, because that was a thing both in this, mostly in the South, but in the North did it too. I actually have receipts from poll taxes. They used to charge a poll tax to vote, and if you made that tax high enough, you could intentionally exclude certain groups of people. Eventually, those became not something that was allowed to be used anymore, but it was around for quite a while. And then the literacy tests were used in the South, and while they pretended that with separate but equal, that they were giving the same test to a white or Black applicant, they were not. They gave the really hard passages and descriptions to Black applicants, which were, even with a strong education and literacy, are going to have difficulty understanding the legal speak of the quote. And for white voters, they gave like simple sentences like, if you're a citizen of the United States, you can vote. Another one was, if you reside in the state, then you can vote in this state. And right, versus a super long paragraph with really technical language. And and then of course there was always the question, are they of good moral character? And if they were able to pass all these other hurdles, you could just say no, right? Well, what if they had some kind of ticket or criminal case against them, which during segregation could be for anything? Then you could immediately deny them for that as well. So women were able to vote everywhere, but legally, that was not the case. And again, the women's suffrage movement, the most kind of well-known white women that were leaders of this movement, really let down Black women in this transition period, where they kind of celebrated and decided they were done, rather than continuing to push with Black women as they had been with the white women, to make sure everyone had the right to vote without loopholes, if you will, in that process. Now, there was artwork that was done after getting the right to vote to celebrate. Here you have the suffragist, and it says "at last," right? And it's justice. And then American nationhood, and then suffragist amendment is there, and they're hugging, right, saying finally at last it has happened here. And then the Life magazine in 1920 wrote congratulations, and you have a woman holding her ballot to vote, and then the embodiment of justice, or liberty, we'll put liberty and justice, shaking her hand. So you had, and there was a whole bunch of these all sprung up. There's a lot of victory art, if you will, and rightfully so. Women worked hard. This was a long fought campaign to get the 19th Amendment. And it did all of this, highlighted women cartoonists and artists, and then they were able to shift and do and continue to have the artwork and display their art both in the victory art and afterwards, in part because of how the suffrage movement brought in these women and started using the cartoons and the satire and the drawings to promote that movement. So that is where we'll end it for this lecture.